Hi everyone, welcome to Live Coding with Codecademy. I'm Dan, an engineer at Codecademy, and today we're going to work through a project in HTML, CSS, and jQuery. The project we're doing today is from our Codecademy Pro offering. You can find out more about Codecademy Pro if you look at the description below. And we're going to get started pretty quick, so I'm going to just go ahead and show you the project we're going to be working on. So here's kind of the end result that we're going to be working towards. It's just a simple threaded comment form. You come to the page, you type in your thoughts, we'll say hey, and when we click post, the comments will go below down in the list. And so we're going to be working through creating the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript for this page from scratch. So I'm going to begin by, in my text editor, creating a new file, and I'm going to call it index.html. And I'm going to start my HTML document with a doctype of HTML. And then I'm going to create an HTML tag and a head tag. And this is how you start pretty much all HTML documents. After the head tag, we're going to put in a body tag. And we're going to close our HTML tag. So the first thing we're going to want to do is look at our example project and kind of break up what we want our site to be. So we see at the top we have a big header. Then we know we're going to have a form for the share your thoughts and the post button on the right. And lastly, we have this list of elements that the individual chat posts themselves. And so the structure we're going to use for that, I'm going to show you on the next page. So we're going to have a header, and inside the header we're going to use a container. It's going to be row based, and we're going to use Bootstrap in this project, so we're going to use columns to lay things out. And so we can get started by creating that header element first. And so I'm going to do that inside of the body, but before I do that, it's important we're going to include the Bootstrap CSS. And the way you do that is you can search on Google for Bootstrap, and you can go to the Bootstrap Getting Started page, and from there you see there's these links to the Bootstrap CDN page. We're going to copy these links and we're going to paste them right into our head of our HTML document, and I have that already copied. So I'm going to go ahead and paste it into my head. And now once it's pasted in my head, I now have use of Bootstrap CSS. And for those of you who don't know, Bootstrap is a CSS framework. It provides a lot of CSS for writing buttons, drop-down menus, and a bunch of other CSS components that you can find out more about on the Bootstrap website. For this project, we're going to be using the Bootstrap grid system specifically. And if you go onto the CSS part of their documentation, you can read a little more about their grid system, but what it allows you to do is create a 12-column grid system and style your page based on that. And it makes a lot of things like responsive design really easy to do. So I'm going to go ahead and make that header that we were talking about, and I'm going to use a header element to do that, and I'm going to give it a class of header as well. And this will allow me to style that element really easily. And I think I'm going to increase my font too, so you guys can see it a little better. So once I create that header, I'm going to go ahead and create the container to put all my elements in. And what this container allows me to do is Bootstrap will apply styles to this element that tell it to fit within the page in a certain way. And it's a good thing to usually put your elements in containers, because then you can make full use of Bootstrap's functionality. And inside my container, I'm going to put a row. And I do that by creating a div and giving it a class of row. And this is going to apply those Bootstrap styles to that element. And so within that row, I now have 12 columns to work with. If we look at our sample, we see that this first header kind of takes up the full width of the page. So in our example HTML, we can do the same thing. And we can do this by giving it a col class of 12. And so we do this by creating another div, and so this will be our column. And the classes we're going to give it two classes. We're going to give it a class of col xs12 and a class of col md12. So what this does is how you do responsive layouts with Bootstrap. So the first class, this col xs12, this makes it so that any device that is smaller than 768 pixels, this div will take up the full 12 columns. And in the case of the device being bigger than that, it'll take up the full columns as well. And so we can do this because we want our top element, the threadly, to always take up the full width. And we'll see how we do this a little differently when we do the share your thoughts in the post button, where we want it to be variable size columns. So inside of my col div, I'm going to create my header, and I'm going to use an H1 for this and just type in threadly. Now that I have some actual text that I'm using, I'm going to be able to refresh the page, and so now we have our version of the project so far. And it's not really styled, and it looks a lot different than what we have over here. So we're going to go ahead and create a CSS file and apply some custom styles to it. So to do that, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to just call it style.css. And once I create that style.css file, I can go into my HTML document, and I have to link to that CSS document just like I did for the Bootstrap styles. And so I do that by doing link rel equal to style sheet. And before, when we had this full URL to the Bootstrap CDN, we can actually do a little bit of a shorter one because the file we're referencing is in the same folder as the file we're currently editing. So I can just type in style.css for my href. And you can do that because the style.css is in the same folder as the index.html file. So now that we have that, we can go ahead and apply our styles to our H1. And the ones we're going to apply, we can look at our example, and we see that we have a left border that's green, and we have our text is moved over a little bit to the right from that border, and the font looks a little bit different. So let's see if we can get that to be close. So I'm going to select that element by selecting the H1, and I'm going to start off by making a border, and I'm going to do border left, and I'm going to do a 2-pixel border. I'm going to do a solid border, and I'm going to do a green that I kind of have in my head already. So I'm going to do 00 F2 8F. And this way of defining colors is called using hex values for them. This is a pretty standard way of defining colors. I'm going to change the font size to be 48 pixels. I want it to be a little bold, so I'm going to set the font weight to be 400 pixels, or just 400, sorry. And I want there to be some padding in between the border on the left and the actual text. So to do that, I'm going to add padding on the left, and we'll set that to 20 pixels. So we can come and refresh our page, and we see that it looks a lot closer to what we had before. But you might notice that the font's a little different, and that's because the example project is using a custom font that we got from Google. So in order for us to use that, we can look on Google Fonts. And the font that we want to use for this is called Montserrat, and you can search for that on Google Fonts to find it. And here's the one that we want to use. And to include it, it's really simple. You just add a line of CSS to the top of your page, and I'll go ahead and for Montserrat, I have it kind of ready to go. And so in my index.html file, I do again another link. And the rel will be style sheet again. And the href will be the link to the Google style sheet. And so that's going to be, I'm going to copy and paste it because it's a little long, and I'll read it off. And it's just https://fonts.googleapis.com/CSS, and then the question mark family equals Montserrat. And we want to include both the 400 weight and the 700 weight. And that by including the 400 and 700 weight, that's what allows us to style things with the font weight at 400. So now once we have that on our page, we need to add some style rules to make it so that we use that font. And I'm going to apply them to the whole page because I want everything to use this font. So to do that, I'll do HTML, and I'll also select the body. And I'll set my font family to be Montserrat. And lots of times when you include fonts, there may be an issue with loading that font, so it's a good thing to also include a fallback font. So for our fallback, we're going to just use any sans serif font. And a sans serif font is a font without the little nubs on the end of the letters. So now when I refresh the page, we see that we have the same font as we had before, and it looks like what we were going for. So now that we have our header element taken care of, we can move on to the form itself. And the form has two elements. It has an input field, and then it has a post button. So we're going to start the same way we did for the previous element for our header. This time we're going to create a div, and we're going to give it a class of main. And this will let us style it later. And inside there, we're again going to use a container div. And so we do that with div class equals container. And just like before, we're going to do a row and do div class equal to row. And so we know we have to have a form, so we can go ahead and create a form element. And so to do that, we just do a form tag. And I'm going to give it a class of form so we can style it. And I just noticed I didn't close my link tab for my Google font URL. It's important to always remember to close your tags, or else you'll get errors that you're not expecting later. And once we have that form, we can now start to use Bootstrap's grid system a little more interesting than what we did for when we just had a 12-column layout for our H1. So the first column we're going to make is going to be it's going to be for our input field, and we're going to give it two classes again. We're going to give it one of col xs8, and so this will say when the device is smaller than 700 pixels to use 8 columns. But we're also this time going to say that when it's a bigger device to use 10 columns. And to make our input field, we're going to use an input element. We're going to give it an ID of comment. The type of the input is a text input. And we also wanted to have some placeholder text. The placeholder text was share your thoughts in our mockup. So to do that, we just add the placeholder attribute. And we set it equal to share your thoughts. Now when I refresh the page, we have our input element here, and we can go ahead and style. We'll style the whole form together. We'll wait until we have our input submit button too. So for the submit button, we're going to create another column div, and this time we're going to say the col xs is 4, and the col md is going to be 2. And so one thing you'll notice is you always want to have inside of a row, right? You always want to have the columns sum up to 12. So before we had just one column and we used 12, so that was making use of all 12 columns. And in this case, we're using 8 and 4, and that sums up to 12. And then for the bigger device, we're using 10 and 2. And I close my form tag a little early there too. So we're going to use a button for our submit element. And to do that, we're going to create a button tag. And the type of it is going to be submit. And we're going to give it a class of button too. And inside of there, we're going to set the text to post, and we can just go ahead and close the button. So now when I refresh the page, we'll see that we have our post button here and our input here. And we can kind of resize the page to show how Bootstrap's grid system behaves a little bit. So as I move to a smaller device, you'll see the button shifts over to the left, and that's because it's now taking up the share your thoughts is taking up fewer columns. It went down from 10 columns to 8 columns, and so that's why that jump happens. And we'll be able to see that more once we style the form a little better. So to style it, we'll go over to our style sheet. And the first thing we're going to style is our input. So to select that, we're going to select a form, and then we're going to additionally select that input. So this way of using CSS says, for a form element, select an input element inside of a form element. We're going to give it a background color that's gray, and we're going to do a gray that's typed in by F0, F0, F0. And we want to have a border on the left of 2 pixels. And it'll be a solid border, and we're actually going to make a white border. And this may seem a little strange right now, but if you look at the mock that we have, when you click, you see there's this fade that goes from having no border to a border. And by setting the border here, it'll allow us to make that transition nice when we add a CSS transition to things. And we're going to set the border to none, because we don't want a border around the whole thing. We just want a border around the left side. So the next thing we're going to do is increase the font size, and we're going to use 36 pixels for it. We're going to give it some padding on the left so that our input text isn't right up against that border that we have. And we'll do that with just putting padding of 20 pixels, and we're going to put it around the whole thing, not just on the left side this time. And we want our form to take up the entire column that it's contained in, so we can set width equal to 100%. And we can refresh and see what we have. And so now that looks pretty close to what we had in our mock-up. We still need to work on the post, and we probably should add some padding in between threadly and share your thoughts. So to do that, we're going to actually add a style to that main element that we have. And so we'll do that by selecting the class that we used for main. And if we look back at our HTML, we use div class equal main. So to select that, we'll use the period notation main. And so that says select an element with the class of main. And we're going to set the margin on the top equal to 80 pixels. Now when I go ahead and refresh the page, we'll see we have a much better spacing in between there. So the next thing we're going to work on is styling our button. And the way we're going to do that is by selecting a button element with the class of btn. And so that's what this syntax is, where we have the button and then immediately without a space .btn says select a button that also has the class btn. So looking at the button, we see it's a green text for post, and there's no background and no border, and there's a little bit of padding. So we can go ahead and do that in our CSS by, we'll say background is transparent. We'll say the border is none. We're going to use that same green that we used for the H1 for the border on the left. And so to change the text color, we use the color. And we're going to set the color to 00F28F. When we hover over the button, we want it to switch to a pointer. So we can say cursor is pointer. And we want to have the font size be the same as we had for our input. So we'll say font size is 36 pixels. And we said we wanted to add some padding to the button. So we'll do padding 20 pixels and 24 pixels. So what this shorthand notation means is the first, when you have padding or margin and you have two numbers, the first number applies to the top and bottom, and the second number applies to the left and the right. So we're giving 20 padding on the top, 20 on the bottom, 24 on the left, and 24 on the right. So I can save my CSS and refresh the HTML document, and so now we have something that looks pretty close to what we have there. And now when I resize, you can see really what setting those col MD and col XS classes do. So when I shrink the page, it gets the number of columns that share your thoughts takes up is smaller so that the page can fit as we get to smaller resolutions. And so this is really good if you want to make a site that's good for mobile. So the next, if we looked at our mock, we see there's these two transitions. When you click on the share your thoughts, the background fades to white and we see the border on the left. And for the post button, when we hover it, we see that the background turns to green and the text turns to white. So we can do this by making a CSS transition. And the way we do CSS transitions is with a CSS property that we can apply to a different state of the input. So for our form input, we want that transition to happen when the input is focused. So we'll select form input again, but we're going to use a CSS modifier on it called focus, and that's just :focus at the end. So this says this element, the CSS rules that I'm going to write here will only apply to the form input when it's focused. So we're going to do a white background. That's FFF. We want to give it a border left. That's 2 pixels. That's solid and is black, and we'll use the hex for that, which is just 000. We're going to remove the box shadow. And one thing when you typically hover over forms, you see that there's this blue border along the outside. We're going to remove that outline by saying outline is none. Now if we refresh the page and we click, you'll see that it does our transition, but it's really jumpy. So what we need to do is define what the transition actually is. So to do that, we're going to go into our form input, and we're going to add a transition property. And we're going to tell it what properties we want to transition and over how long we want them to transition for. So we want the background to transition over a period of 2 seconds, and we want the border left to transition over a period of 2 seconds. So now if I refresh the page and click on the Share Your Thoughts button, we see the transition is smooth and it goes over those 2 seconds that we had for the that we wrote in our background transition property. And so we're going to do the same exact thing for our button, and I'm going to create a new class at the bottom. And I'm going to select my button again, and this time instead of focus, we're going to use hover because we want this transition to apply when the element is hovered, not focused. And we're going to, for this, all we're going to do is swap the background and the color. So the background now is going to be green, and so that's that 00F28F. And the color is going to switch to white, which we can do with FFF. Now when I go and refresh my page and I hover over the post, we get that jumpy behavior again, and so that means we need to apply the transition property to our button.btn. So we're going to do transition again, and this time we're going to say the background transitions over 2 seconds and the color transitions over 2 seconds. So now when I refresh the page and I hover over post, we get that clean transition there and the clean transition back to the non-selected state. So now that we have our form in place, we're going to go ahead and make our list element that will contain our comments. And we're going to do this using an unordered list element. And the way you make an unordered list element is by doing UL. We're going to give it a class equal to comments. And we'll also give it an ID equal to comments. And so this will allow us, when we write the jQuery part of the page, to select the element by its ID. And I'm going to write two just kind of example comments so we'll be able to kind of have some data to work with in the beginning. And the ones that we had on the page were, have you felt it, and there has been an awakening. So I'll go ahead and write them in. And the li is just a standard list element. I can refresh my page and I have my two elements, but they're not styled anywhere near what I want them to be. So I have to add some custom styles again. I'll go into my style sheet and I'm going to select the comments element, and I'm going to give it some padding above so it's not so close to the share your thoughts form. So I'll say we'll do that with margin, and we'll do margin top 20 pixels. And one thing you can see here is we have these little dots on the left side. The way we get rid of that is by setting the list style to none. And we're also going to set padding left equal to 0 pixels. We do this because browsers automatically apply some padding for UL elements, and so we have to override what the defaults are in order to get it how we want it to be. I can refresh the page, and we no longer have our dots. The comments are up on the left, but we still don't have quite what they are here. So we can go ahead and add some styles to our individual LI elements themselves. So to do that, we'll select the LI elements on the page, and we're going to give them padding left of 20 pixels. And this will allow us to set our border off of the comments themselves. We're going to add a border left of 2 pixels. That's solid, and this time we're going to use black for the border. We're going to increase the font size again and set it to 36 pixels. Now if I refresh, we're pretty good, but the only thing is there's a little bit of space in between them, so we're going to give them some margin. And so this gives them bottom margin of 36 pixels. And so if I refresh now, they're spaced much better, and they look pretty close to what our mockup has here. So now that we have our page styled, we can go on to adding the JavaScript functionality so we can type into the form. Now if we try to type into the form, we'll see that we don't really get anything that happens. We click post and it just kind of refreshes the page. So to add the JavaScript functionality, we're going to make use of jQuery. And to include jQuery, we can include it from a CDN, just like we did for the Bootstrap CDN. And I have that link already copied into my clipboard. So I can go ahead, and I'm going to put this script at the bottom of the page. And we're going to put all our scripts at the bottom of the page so that they load after all the HTML is loaded. So I'm going to type script, and the source is going to be equal to a CDN URL for jQuery. And you can find this URL if you search on Google for jQuery CDN. And you'll see you go to the jQuery site, and you can just copy the link to the minified jQuery or the uncompressed. And we're using jQuery 2 for this. And if you're using IE 9 or below, you should use jQuery 1. So now that we have our jQuery code included, we need to have our own script. So we're going to create a new file, and we're going to call it script.js. And now that we've created our script, we need to also include it on our page. So right below the jQuery script, we're going to say script source, and just like with our style sheet, how we were able to use a relative URL, we can do the same thing for our script. And then we're going to close it with a script tag. And the ordering here is very important because our script is going to use jQuery. We need to include it after jQuery has been loaded, and so by by writing the script tag after the jQuery tag, it'll ensure that our script runs after the jQuery script. So in our script file, we're going to create a main function, and we do that by saying var main equals function. And we want this main function because we want it to be run when the page loads. And so the way we have this function run when the page loads is by using jQuery. And we're going to do, the way we access jQuery is with the $sign variable. So we're going to type $sign, we're going to use the parentheses, and we're going to select document. And we're going to say when the document is ready, we want our main function to be called. And so this is the standard syntax for doing that. So this says jQuery when, select the document, and then attach a listener to the document that is called when the document is ready. And then when the document is ready, we're going to call our main function. So now that we have this in place, we can write all of our code to handle the interactions on our page inside of our main function. So the one interaction that we have to work on is the interaction that happens when you submit the form. So to do that, we can use jQuery to select that form element. So we can use $sign again, and this time we're going to use form. And so this tells jQuery to select all the form elements on the page. And since we only have one form on the page, that's why we're able to just select form. And we want to attach an event listener to the submit action. And so we do that by, after we've selected our form, by calling the submit function. And we want to pass that submit function another function. And this is called our event listener. And so now we have a function that will get called whenever the form is submitted. And so this is where we're going to put our interactions for when the form is submitted. And the first thing we want to do is when the form is submitted, we want to get the text that's in our input box, and we want to store it inside of a variable. So to do that, we're going to first, we want to select that form input itself. So we can do that and put it into a variable. We'll call the variable $sign input. And we're going to use jQuery again. And we want to select the target of the event. And so that'll be equal to the form itself. And so we can do that by saying event.target. And anytime you're working with jQuery and you attach an event listener to something, the first argument that gets passed to your listener is an event. And that event has different properties, and one of the properties is the element that triggered that action. And so in this case, that element will be the form that we had here. So now that we've selected our form element, we want to select our input element within that form. So to do that, we are going to use the find function. And so now we type find, and we specify the element inside of our form that we want to find. And in this case, it's going to be the input element. So now that we have our input stored in a variable, we can get the value of the input. And the way we do that is by using the val function. So I'm going to create a new variable called comment, and I'm going to assign the value of it to input.val. So now that we have the comment, we can actually go about inserting the comment into the list below. And so I'm going to use an if statement because I don't want to insert empty comments. So I can check to see that the comment actually has some text by saying if comment is not equal to an empty string. So if the comment is actually a real comment, we can then go ahead and create an HTML element for the li. And I do that by saying, we can say var HTML is equal to $sign. And we're going to actually write HTML in here this time. And so anytime you write HTML inside of the jQuery function, it'll create, instead of selecting an element on the page, it'll create a new element. And so by doing this, we've created a new li element. And we want to set the text inside of that li to be equal to our comment. And we can do that by using the text function. So we do .text, and we pass in our comment. So now we've created a li element that has the text of our comment inside of it. So we now want to take that text, and we want to insert it down below into our comments list. So we can do that by using the prepend to function. And we use that by, we take our element, which is our li HTML, and we're going to prepend it to another element, and we can pass it a CSS selector. So we can pass it the comments that we did before. So if we look back in our HTML document, we gave this an ID of comments, so we can use that to select that element and set the HTML to that. So we'll do £. Pound is the way you reference ID of an element. So we're going to prepend it to comments. So now we can see what happens if we refresh the page. So if I go ahead and type, I'll just do some gibberish and hit post. It may, I'm not sure if it'll show up, but you see a little flash down below, and then the page seems to refresh. And what's happening there is all browsers have default behaviors that they execute when a submit on a forum is called, and we don't really want the browser to do the default thing because we're overriding it with our custom code. So the way we tell the browser to not do what it normally would do is by returning false at the end of our function. And this will say, don't do anything more with this event, the submit event that happened. It kind of ends the execution. So now if I refresh the page and I can post hey in my form and click post, we see our comment goes down below, and one thing that's a little weird is our comment is still left over, so you could accidentally hit enter a few times. So we can get rid of that text by selecting getting our input that we saved in a variable before, and we can use the val function again, but this time by passing an empty string to the val, we can go ahead and clear the input. So I'm going to save the page and refresh, and now when I type hey, we can see that the new li element goes down below, the form clears, and it works how we set out to make it work. And so that's it for this project. We have some time, so I'm going to try to do my best and see if I can answer a few questions that may have come across during the time. The chat has been pretty fast, so it may not do so well. I saw a couple questions about, is it possible to watch this later? Yeah, this video, we're not going to take it down, so if you just come back, you can watch it later. And then can I get a download of this code? Yeah, we can post it online, and we'll include the link to the code in the comments after the video has been released, so you can get it there. I think that'll probably be the easiest way. So one question is for Bootstrap and jQuery, what happens if the CDN goes down, and does this happen? If the CDN were to go down, you wouldn't be able to use the jQuery and Bootstrap CSS, but it's very unlikely that this will happen. There's tons of websites that rely on the jQuery and Bootstrap CDNs, and so you can be pretty confident that they're not going to go down. And then what's the relationship between JavaScript and jQuery? jQuery is a JavaScript library that allows, it's really useful to handle things like browser compatibility. It's just kind of an additional tool set on top of JavaScript that helps helps you write code a little bit quicker. Another question is, when should one use padding and when should you use margin? So the difference between padding and margin is kind of a tricky one. The way you can think about it is margin is what it goes between elements that are next to each other. So if we were to look back at our HTML document and we see that we have this header element and we have our div here. So if we were to apply margin top to this div, it'll add space between the header and the div because that margin applies outside of an element. But in some cases, you want to apply spacing when you're actually inside of an element. So a common reason you would do this is if the text inside of your element isn't an element. So like we did this for our button. So if you want to add spacing between the where the post is and where the border is, for instance, you could add padding because the padding will apply inside of the element. And we can actually look at how that happens. I'll add a border to the post button here. If I go back to my button and if I say we'll do border is we'll do 2 pixels solid and we'll set it to black. So now when I refresh my page, you can see that there's space in between the post text and the border, and that's because we used padding here instead of margin. And so here's that padding that's 20 pixels and 24 pixels. So the way to think about it is padding is for things on the inside and margin is for things on the outside. Where can I go to learn more about the Bootstrap and the grid system? Go to the Bootstrap website. You can it's just getbootstrap.com, and you can on the top of the page, if you click on CSS and scroll a little down, one of the first things they talk about is the grid system, and I would just go ahead and read through that a little bit. And if you need a little more help, you can go to our Make a Website course on Codecademy. So if you go to codecademy.com and you go to our, on the bottom, Make a Website course, you can go through this course, and we do a lot of stuff with Bootstrap on here, so it'll teach you a bit too. And for those that you don't know about why you would use Bootstrap and why responsive design is important, what responsive design allows you to do is change the layout of your page for different size screens. This is really useful if you want to have a website that works both on mobile and on desktop. And I can demonstrate this again if you look on our page. Right now we have this element taking up the full width. So now if I were to shrink this a little bit, we see that this gets a little smaller and it takes up less space. And that's because we now are on a smaller device. So I go back to my HTML, and if I were to change this to say, remove these excess, and so that we only are ever styling for big devices. So now if I save that and refresh, so now the Share Your Thoughts will always take 12 columns, and the post will always take up 2 columns. So I can refresh my page, and now if I resize, you see that the layout gets a little bit screwy, and that's because the post element, the post button, has a fixed size, and it needs to be contained in that 2 columns. So if it can't be contained on the 2 columns, it pushes down below. And so that's why it's really useful to use responsive design, because it ensures that your web page will look good on both mobile devices and on desktop devices. What would we have to do to make the comments we're posting stay even after we refresh the page? So to do this, you'd have to use some kind of server-side language. You could use Ruby on Rails. You could use Node.js. You could even use something like Firebase. I would recommend checking out our course on Ruby on Rails. It'll teach you how to save data and retrieve it back on the server. And that's all the time we have for questions. Thanks everyone for joining today. I hope you learned a lot. And again, if you're interested in doing more projects like this, you should check out Codecademy Pro. I think there's links in the description. There's a ton of projects like this, and I hope everyone has a fantastic day. And we're going to put, just so if you're not, we'll put links to all the files that we've been using in the description below, or in the comments afterwards. So thanks everyone, and have a good one.